The grand ballroom of Kensington Palace sparkled under the light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. Tonight was the annual charity gala for the Royal Foundation, an event that brought together Britain's most influential figures, celebrities, and philanthropists. The air was thick with anticipation, and the subtle fragrance of expensive perfumes mixing with the aroma of gourmet canapés being served by white-gloved waiters. Princess Catherine stood near the entrance, greeting guests with her trademark grace and warmth. Her midnight blue evening gown, designed by Alexander McQueen, caught the light beautifully as she moved. The dress featured delicate beadwork that seemed to shimmer with every gesture, and her sapphire earrings complemented the ensemble perfectly. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, with a few carefully placed strands framing her face. Prince William, dressed in his formal black tie attire, stood beside his wife, though his usual confident demeanor seemed slightly strained tonight. His smile, while present for the cameras and guests, didn't quite reach his eyes. Catherine noticed this immediately. Having learned to read her husband's moods over their years together, she caught his eye and gave him a subtle, questioning look. But he simply nodded and continued with his duties. The evening's program was ambitious. There were several speeches planned, a live auction featuring exclusive items donated by various celebrities, and a performance by a renowned classical quartet. The funds raised would support mental health initiatives, a cause particularly close to both William and Catherine's hearts. They had worked tirelessly to organize this event, spending weeks coordinating with their staff and ensuring every detail was perfect. As guests began to fill the ballroom, Catherine found herself separated from William by the crowd. She moved through the room with practiced ease, stopping to chat with donors, thanking sponsors, and posing for photographs. She spoke with Lady Margaret Worthington about the new children's mental health program, listened intently as Sir James Morrison shared his thoughts on expanding their outreach efforts, and warmly greeted the ambassador from Italy, who had flown in specifically for the event. Meanwhile, William was engaged in conversation with several members of Parliament near the bar area. The discussion had started pleasantly enough, focusing on upcoming legislation that would benefit their charitable initiatives. However, as the conversation progressed, it became clear that one of the MPs had stronger political opinions than appropriate for such an event. The man, slightly red-faced from champagne, began making pointed comments about recent government policies and expecting William to take sides. William's training in diplomacy served him well, but Catherine could see from across the room that he was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. His posture had stiffened, and he was using his formal, measured tone rather than his usual conversational style. She excused herself from her current conversation and began making her way toward him, but the crowd was dense, and progress was slow. The live auction had just begun when Catherine noticed William's phone buzzing insistently in his pocket. He discreetly pulled it out and glanced at the screen, his face immediately clouding over with concern. The caller ID showed his private secretary's number, and given the late hour, this could only mean something urgent had arisen. He looked around the room, caught Catherine's eye, and made a subtle gesture toward the exit. Catherine understood immediately. In their years of public life together, they had developed a system of non-verbal communication that allowed them to coordinate during events without drawing attention. She nodded slightly, indicating she would handle things while he took the call. William slipped out through a side door that led to the palace's private offices. The call lasted longer than expected. Through the closed door, Catherine could hear the murmur of William's voice, though she couldn't make out the words. His tone suggested the conversation was serious and potentially problematic. She continued to mingle with guests, but part of her attention remained focused on that side door, waiting for William's return. When he finally emerged 20 minutes later, his face was pale, and his usual composed expression had been replaced by one of barely controlled stress. He approached Catherine during a brief lull in conversations and leaned close to her ear. "I need to leave," he whispered urgently. "There's been a situation that requires my immediate attention." Catherine's heart sank. She knew how much this event meant to both of them, and for William to consider leaving early, the situation must be truly serious. She searched his face for clues about what might be wrong. but his expression revealed nothing beyond the obvious stress. "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "Is everything all right? Is there anything I should know?" William glanced around to ensure no one was watching them too closely. "I'll explain later. Just continue with the program as planned. Make my apologies to Lord Pemberton and the auction committee. Tell them I was called away on urgent royal business." Before Catherine could ask more questions, William was already moving toward the exit. She watched him go, noting how he avoided eye contact with most of the guests, and seemed to be trying to make his departure as inconspicuous as possible. Unfortunately, in a room full of people accustomed to watching royal protocol, his early exit did not go entirely unnoticed. Several guests glanced in his direction as he left, and Catherine saw a few puzzled expressions among the crowd. She knew she would need to address his absence gracefully to prevent speculation and gossip that might overshadow the evening's charitable purpose. The auction continued, with Catherine seamlessly stepping into William's role when needed. She bid on several items herself to keep the energy high and encouraged others to participate generously. Her natural charisma and genuine enthusiasm for the cause helped maintain the festive atmosphere. But beneath her polished exterior, her mind was racing with questions about what could have prompted William's sudden departure. As the evening progressed, Catherine found herself paying closer attention to the guests' conversations and interactions. She noticed things she might have missed if William had remained by her side to share the social responsibilities. There were subtle undercurrents in some conversations, meaningful glances exchanged between certain guests, and a few individuals who seemed more interested in observing others than participating in the festivities. With William gone, Catherine found herself in an unusual position. Normally, their public appearances were carefully choreographed affairs where both royals knew exactly where the other would be at any given moment. Tonight, she was flying solo, and this newfound independence allowed her to observe the gala from a completely different perspective. She moved through the crowd with renewed focus, no longer simply fulfilling her role as co-host, but actively watching and listening. It was then that she began to notice patterns she had missed before. Near the champagne fountain, she observed Victoria Ashworth, the wife of a prominent businessman, engaged in what appeared to be a heated but hushed conversation with Marcus Blackwood, a journalist known for his investigative pieces on the royal family. Catherine had met Victoria several times at previous events. The woman was usually bubbly and social, always eager to discuss her latest charity work or her children's accomplishments at prestigious schools. Tonight, however, Victoria seemed tense and kept glancing around nervously while speaking with Blackwood. Their conversation was intense, and Catherine noticed Victoria discreetly slip something that looked like a folded paper into Blackwood's jacket pocket. Intrigued, Catherine positioned herself strategically behind a large floral arrangement where she could observe without being obvious. She pretended to admire the white roses and peonies while straining to catch fragments of their conversation over the ambient noise of the party. "The timing couldn't be worse," Victoria was saying in a low voice. "If this comes out now, it will destroy everything we've worked for." Blackwood nodded gravely. "That's exactly why it needs to come out now. The public has a right to know before any major announcements are made." Catherine's pulse quickened. What announcement could they be referring to? Her mind immediately went to William's sudden departure. Could there be a connection between his emergency phone call and whatever these two were discussing? "You don't understand the collateral damage this will cause," Victoria continued. "Innocent people will be hurt. People who had nothing to do with any of this. Sometimes that's unavoidable." Blackwood replied coldly. "The truth is the truth, regardless of who it affects." Before Catherine could hear more, the classical quartet began their second set, and the increased volume made eavesdropping impossible. She watched as Victoria and Blackwood parted ways, with Victoria heading toward the ladies' room and Blackwood moving toward the auction area where he began taking notes on his phone. Catherine's training in social situations had taught her to maintain her composure, regardless of circumstances, but her mind was now racing with possibilities. She tried to recall recent events that might be relevant. There had been some minor controversies in the tabloids recently, but nothing that seemed significant enough to warrant such secrecy and concern. She decided to follow Victoria discreetly, hoping to learn more about what had transpired between her and the journalist. Catherine made her way through the crowd, stopping occasionally to exchange pleasantries with guests to avoid appearing suspicious. By the time she reached the corridor leading to the ladies' room, Victoria was emerging, looking visibly shaken. "Victoria," Catherine called out warmly, approaching with her signature smile. "How lovely to see you tonight. I was hoping we'd have a chance to catch up." Victoria startled slightly at the sound of her name, then quickly composed herself. "Your Royal Highness, what a wonderful event. You and Prince William have outdone yourselves." Catherine noticed that Victoria's hands were trembling slightly, and there were beads of perspiration on her forehead despite the cool temperature in the corridor. "Thank you so much. I'm afraid William had to step away on urgent business, but I'm so glad you could be here. How is Charles doing? And the children?" At the mention of her husband's name, Victoria's face went pale. "Oh, they're fine. Charles is traveling for business at the moment. The children are at school, of course." There was something in Victoria's tone that didn't ring true. Catherine had excellent instincts about people, developed through years of meeting thousands of individuals in various circumstances. Victoria was definitely hiding something, and her nervousness was becoming more apparent by the minute. "I hope he's not missing anything too important," Catherine said casually. "Business travel can be so demanding these days." Victoria's laugh sounded forced. "Oh, you know how it is. Sometimes these trips come up suddenly and can't be postponed." Catherine was about to probe further when they were interrupted by Lord Pemberton, the evening's auction chairman, who appeared at the end of the corridor looking somewhat frazzled. "Your Royal Highness," he said, slightly out of breath. "I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but we have a small situation with one of the auction items. The authentication papers for the signed Beatles album seem to have gone missing, and the bidding is about to begin." Catherine glanced back at Victoria, who seemed relieved at the interruption. "Of course, Lord Pemberton. Victoria, it was lovely chatting with you. We must get together properly soon." As Catherine walked away with Lord Pemberton, she heard Victoria's heels clicking rapidly on the marble floor as the woman hurried back toward the main ballroom. Catherine made a mental note to follow up on this conversation later, as Victoria's behavior had raised several red flags. The auction item crisis was resolved quickly once Catherine arrived. The authentication papers were found in the wrong folder, and the Beatles album went on to fetch an impressive sum for the charity. However, Catherine's attention was now divided between her hostess duties and her growing curiosity about the evening's underlying tensions. She began to notice other strange interactions throughout the room. Sir Edmund Hartley, a usually gregarious member of Parliament, was having a tense phone conversation in a corner, frequently looking over his shoulder as if worried about being overheard. Mrs. Penelope Foster, who chaired several important committees, seemed to be avoiding certain guests entirely, taking circuitous routes around the room to prevent encounters. Most notably, Catherine observed that several guests kept checking their phones with unusual frequency. In royal circles, excessive phone use during formal events was considered poor etiquette. Yet tonight, multiple attendees were discreetly glancing at their devices and occasionally typing urgent messages. The realization began to dawn on Catherine that something significant was happening beyond the palace walls, something that many of the guests seemed to know about, but were trying to keep from becoming public knowledge during the event. The question remained, what was it? And why had William been called away? As the auction concluded, and the evening moved toward its final phase, Catherine decided to take a more direct approach. She sought out Marcus Blackwood, who was now standing near the exit, presumably preparing to leave early himself. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, approaching with her most charming smile, "I don't believe we've had a proper chance to speak this evening. Thank you so much for supporting our cause." Blackwood turned, his expression immediately shifting to one of professional courtesy mixed with wariness. He was a seasoned journalist who knew that conversations with royals could be minefields if not navigated carefully. "Your Royal Highness, the pleasure is entirely mine. This has been a remarkable evening. Your foundation's work continues to be truly inspiring." Catherine studied his face as he spoke. I'm so pleased you think so. I hope you'll write favorably about tonight's event. Positive media coverage helps us reach even more people who might benefit from our programs. There was something in her tone that made Blackwood pause. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully before responding. Of course, Your Royal Highness, though I should mention that my editor has asked me to focus primarily on the fundraising aspects rather than other elements of the evening. The phrase, other elements, hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that Catherine was determined to decode. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine at Blackwood's carefully chosen words. The phrase, other elements, confirmed her suspicion that there was indeed something happening beneath the surface of tonight's festivities. She maintained her composure, but her mind was working rapidly to piece together the fragments of information she had gathered throughout the evening. Other elements? She asked with carefully controlled curiosity, tilting her head slightly, as if she didn't quite understand his meaning. I'm afraid I'm not following you, Mr. Blackwood. The journalist's eyes darted around the room before settling back on her face. He seemed to be having an internal debate about how much to reveal. Forgive me, Your Royal Highness. Perhaps I misspoke. I simply meant that sometimes events like these can have unexpected developments that overshadow the charitable work being done. Catherine realized she was walking a delicate line. Pushing too hard might cause Blackwood to retreat entirely, but she needed to understand what was happening. I see. Well, I certainly hope there haven't been any unexpected developments tonight. Prince William and I have worked so hard to make this evening perfect for our guests and our cause. At the mention of William's name, Blackwood's expression shifted subtly. Catherine caught the change immediately and pressed forward gently. Speaking of my husband, I noticed you seemed particularly interested when he stepped away earlier. I hope his early departure hasn't caused any inconvenience for your coverage of the event. Blackwood hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Your Royal Highness, I think you may want to speak with your husband about tonight's circumstances. I'm sure he can provide you with far more accurate information than I could. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine's private secretary, Sarah Mills, who approached with an expression of barely controlled panic. Your Royal Highness, she said in a low voice. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but I need to speak with you privately. It's quite urgent. Catherine excused herself from Blackwood with practiced grace, but not before noticing the knowing look that passed between him and Sarah. Her stomach dropped as she realized that her own staff were apparently aware of whatever situation was unfolding. Sarah led her to a small anteroom off the main ballroom, closing the door behind them. The sudden quiet after the noise of the party was almost jarring, and Catherine could see that Sarah's hands were shaking slightly. What's happening, Sarah? Catherine asked directly. And please don't tell me it's nothing. I've been watching people all evening, and something is clearly wrong. Sarah took a deep breath. Your Royal Highness, there's been a development regarding Charles Ashworth, Victoria's husband. Catherine's mind immediately went back to her conversation with Victoria earlier, remembering the woman's nervousness when Charles was mentioned. What kind of development? He's been arrested, ma'am. About 2 hours ago. The charges involve financial fraud related to several of his business dealings. Some of those dealings apparently involved charities, including organizations that have received funding from the Royal Foundation. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. The implications were staggering. If Charles Ashworth had been involved in financial fraud, and some of that fraud connected to charities supported by the Royal Foundation, the scandal could potentially damage everything she and William had worked to build. How extensive is it? Catherine asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. We don't know yet. That's why Prince William left. He's meeting with lawyers and advisors to determine the extent of the Foundation's potential exposure. The arrest hasn't been made public yet, but several journalists are already investigating the story. Catherine understood now why Victoria had seemed so distressed, why she had been speaking urgently with Blackwood, and why so many guests had been checking their phones throughout the evening. Word was already spreading through certain circles, even though the official announcement hadn't been made. Is that why Mr. Blackwood is here tonight? Is he working on the story? Sarah nodded grimly. We believe so. Several media outlets are likely preparing pieces for tomorrow's editions. Prince William's team is working on damage control, but the situation is quite serious. Catherine sank into one of the anteroom's chairs, her mind racing through the potential consequences. The Royal Foundation's reputation was built on transparency and careful vetting of all partnerships and funding recipients. If they had unknowingly supported fraudulent activities, it could undermine years of careful work and damage their ability to help the causes they cared about most deeply. What does William need me to do? She asked, switching immediately into crisis mode. For now, continue with the evening as planned. Don't let on that anything is wrong. The legal team wants to control how and when this information becomes public. If guests realize there's a crisis, it could make things worse. Catherine nodded, understanding the delicate balance required. She had to return to the ballroom and continue playing the perfect hostess, while internally processing the potential destruction of everything they had built together. As she prepared to return to the party, Sarah added quietly, "There's one more thing, ma'am. Victoria Ashworth has been trying to reach you all evening. We believe she may want to warn you about what's coming, or perhaps ask for help. Her husband's arrest has left her in a very difficult position." Catherine paused at the door. "Where is she now?" "Still at the party, as far as we know. She seems to be trying to maintain normalcy, just as you are." Catherine returned to the ballroom with her mind clearer but her heart heavier. She now understood the undercurrents she had been sensing all evening. She looked around the room with new eyes, seeing the guests not just as supporters of their cause but as potential sources of information, speculation, and gossip that could either help or harm them in the coming days. She spotted Victoria near the dessert table, standing alone and looking lost. Their eyes met across the room, and Catherine saw a mixture of guilt, fear, and desperation in the other woman's expression. Victoria clearly wanted to approach her, but seemed unsure whether it would be appropriate or wise. Catherine made the decision for both of them, walking purposefully across the room. When she reached Victoria, she spoke in a low voice that couldn't be overheard by nearby guests. "Victoria, I think we need to have that proper conversation we mentioned earlier. Would you like to step outside for some fresh air?" Victoria's relief was palpable. "Yes, Your Royal Highness. I would very much appreciate that." They walked together toward the palace gardens, away from the noise and the watching eyes. As they stepped onto the terrace, Victoria finally broke down, her composed facade crumbling entirely. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I never knew what Charles was doing. I never would have let him involve organizations you support if I had known. He told me these were legitimate business investments." Catherine felt a wave of compassion for the woman, despite the potential damage her husband's actions might cause. "Victoria, we'll get through this together. The most important thing right now is the truth. We need to know everything so we can protect the people and organizations that might be affected." As they spoke quietly in the garden, the party continued inside, with guests gradually beginning to depart. Catherine knew that by tomorrow, everything would be different. The story would break, investigations would begin, and she and William would face one of the biggest challenges of their public life together. But tonight, in the quiet garden, with Victoria's quiet sobs as background to the distant sound of the party, Catherine felt a strange sense of clarity. Whatever came next, they would face it honestly and directly. The truth, however painful, was always better than secrets and deception. The gala that had begun as a celebration of their charitable work had become something entirely different. A night that would mark the beginning of a difficult chapter in their lives. But it had also revealed Catherine's strength and intuition, qualities that would prove essential in the challenging days ahead.